Good morning. Can everyone hear okay? Perfect.
So they're going to be able to hear all of us. Can you hear me too? Andy, I see you.
Yeah, it's this guy right here.
Oh, okay, I'll project out. So, I wanted to just double check. I think Chicky's also joining. Oh, yeah, great. Hi, Andy. Hi, Chicky. We're gonna get started in a minute. I think Dawn's coming in person, right? Yes. Okay, so we're waiting. Dawn should be here soon. So I'm going to go ahead and get us started because I know that we have a full agenda today. So I'm Siobhan Martin. I am the chair of the PEBB board. I'm going to officially convene the meeting, our retreat today. I'll do a quick roll call. For Kimberly Hendricks. Here. Don Markman. Here. Ray.
I am here.
And Chicky.
Present by phone and video.
I am not hearing you, but I saw you speaking. Is there, can we check that out to make sure that the audio is working for our participants online? Can you talk again, Chicky? I see your mute is on.
Present by phone and video.
Well, I can barely hear you. So is there something we can do around the audio? We definitely want Andy and Chicky to be able to participate.
You're coming through clear on Teams, just to let you know. So I think it's a
Someone's
speaker
coming
issue
up with
there.
that. That's with the audio. Let me know when you want to speak again.
Okay, go ahead.
Okay, try again, Chicky. We'll see if we can hear you.
Good morning, Chicky Flowers, present by phone, audio, and video.
It's not coming through. Doing some adjustments again. I'll just let her know when to talk.
I'm just not sure what to change because we already tested this morning. Everything was working correct.
Yeah, Andy, why don't you speak and see if it's different with your audio? It's
Andy, present.
same for you. Very faint. I gonna allow me in as a guest.
I know.
I'm trying, yeah, did you?
Okay, Cheeky, you want to try talking again?
Good morning, Chicky Flowers present by phone and video.
We can hear you. That's great. Thank you. And Andy?
Present.
All right, I think we are ready to begin. We do expect Dawn to join us. Rob Nose is not able to join us today, and neither is Kate Nass. So just, they're both excused. So I think I'm handing it over to you, Andrew.
Yes.
Yeah, great.
Morning, everyone. Glad to see you all again. Yeah, as saying to Siobhan as we were walking in, seeing folks 2 times in 2 months is almost like semblance of normal, like the before times. So yeah, I'll just make a couple of comments before we dive.
I'll do to whoever. There we go. Can you guys hear?
And Dawn has joined us. I didn't know audio too. It's fine. Yeah, all good. All right, Andrew, I think we're good.
Okay, all right, I will proceed, and just stop me if the audio stops again. And so after we do the recap of our discussion from last month, we'll shift gears. We'll talk about some things that we are seeing as emerging strategies in the market that we think might be of interest to PEBB. We'll talk about the intersection of some of those strategies with health equity and well-being. We'll then move on to talking about what tools you have available to you as you think about, well, how do we actually achieve these goals? You've got sort of different levers at your disposal. Some are more oriented towards short-term accomplishments, some are more long-term timelines. There's sort of pros and cons to the different tools that you have. And then in the last section there, this is going to be our breakout session. And this is going to be where we are going to split you into groups, and we're going to talk about what goals you'd like to see PEBB accomplish in the long term, next like 3 to 5 years. And then we'll get back together as a group and sort of talk about what goals the group has come up with. We'll prioritize those. Those should be very useful as we're shifting gears and looking at the renewals, just sort of kicking off like right now. But there'll also be lots of other great reasons to have those long-term goals sort of articulated and use as sort of like a North Star. All right, so let's jump ahead and we'll just do this 15 or 20-minute recap of the last retreat. And so after the last retreat, on our end at Mercer, we got together and compared notes and we talked about, well, what were the key things that we heard? We came up with these 4 themes on the left. This is certainly not an exhaustive list, so I'll open it up to folks in a minute for their thoughts. But these were the 4 themes that we sort of heard the most and seemed sort of like they had the most discussion around them. And so the first is around rising costs. No surprise there. There's obviously member impact when costs are increasing, whether that's costs at a time of service as folks are going to their doctors or their deductions out of their paycheck. Those have real impacts for your members. Another theme we heard was around access. And so this sort of comes in different flavors. Rural access, making sure folks living in rural communities have the care that they need, have access to that care. Folks living outside Oregon, PEBB membership has a really broad footprint. It's not just Oregon. So do those folks have adequate access? And then sort of more broadly, just access around mental health, behavioral health services, which has been a sort of a perennial issue that we've talked about for some time, but it's still one that's out there that is sort of ongoing. The third theme is around health equity. Probably no surprise there. So we spent a lot of time talking about PEBB's journey over the last 2 years. And so the retreat from 2 years ago, led by Michael Garrett, sort of established health equity as the core strategy for PEBB. So we spent a lot of time talking about how that came to be, what's been accomplished from a health equity perspective over the last 2 years. We spent a little bit of time talking about how we advance that as we sort of look into the future. We've got some more sort of comments along those lines for today as well. And then the fourth theme we heard was around preserving the richness of benefits. So PEBB has a really rich benefits, really low contributions. It's a key part of sort of the total rewards package for folks. It's important to members. And so how do we maintain that richness, especially as we see what we are anticipating to be two or three difficult renewals over the next few years. And so trying to balance preserving the richness within the reality of a 3.4% cost cap. Let me pause there and see if folks have additional thoughts or other things that you've been thinking about over the past month that you think warrants discussion as we sort of think about our discussion last month and then transitioning into these topics for today. Do these hit the mark? Do you see these four and think, yeah, this is pretty much captures it?
And Andy and Chicky, I'm gonna pay attention to the chat if y'all want to chat, or if you want to raise your hand just so that you're able to participate.
All right, sounds good. And so again, when we think about what we talked about last month, which was sort of grounding in the current state of the PEBB plans, talking about the historical journey and how PEBB got to where it is today, we're going to continue along those lines today. With the ultimate goal of sort of talking about going through that exercise with the long-term goals. And so we've got a couple more slides on the recap section. So if you could advance one, Maggie, please. There is discuss. So here are the health equity strategic pillars. It's a little bit hard to see on the screen, but in your printout, you can probably more easily see the text that's highlighted in purple. And so we went ahead and based on our discussion, we did make some adjustments to the strategic pillars. There was also a comment around, we should probably be revisiting this every year, which I think makes a lot of sense. And so we took the liberty to make those updates. Some of them are around sort of language updates. So in the far left column around key collaborators, we've gotten rid of the term priority populations and updated that. But some of them are more substantial. The second column from the left, this one used to be, let's see how to reword it. Decision-making based on a health equity lens. And so we've updated that one to decision-making centered on health equity. My interpretation of that difference is that it's sort of like getting health equity on the ground floor. And so based on interpreting the old definition where you're using a lens, it's almost like a checkbox. If you're going through a decision-making process, okay, evaluate the cost, member impact, okay, now let's evaluate health equity, sort of like a stop along the way, versus centering it as more like health equity by design from the outset. But I think I want to pause there and get other folks' reactions to that interpretation because, that might not align with how other folks are thinking of it. And I know, John, this is a comment you guys, I'd love to hear from you if that was sort of along the lines that you're getting at or not.
I was appreciating seeing the faces of our participants in the corner. That was awesome. I like where you've gone with that. Thank you. Dawn Mountner, good morning. She, her, a white person, long dark hair from OHA. And I appreciate the centered, in health equity or on health equity. I appreciated the visual you gave there of having health equity come in on the ground floor, because it means we build on it. And I wonder if that makes more sense than centered in health equity, which is the language that I have heard more, which means to me that we're in, like, we gotta jump into the pool and acknowledge that from every direction, we need to be thinking about it in all of our interactions with others, externally as well as internally, and thinking about how our structures themselves need to be centered and built with equity in mind, so that the rest of the stuff that we do and programs we design and communications that we write, et cetera, reflect that value. But other than the semantics potentially around in, I really like that. There's one other word there, which is burdened by. And I think probably that was carefully chosen, that burdened by, but maybe it's, you know, disproportionately impacted by is the language that I have heard, and it doesn't specify holding the weight of something in the way that burdened by does. And so I just call those two questions, the centered on versus centered in, and the burdened by versus some other less directional term, impacted by one way or another, knocked off center or set back or pressed down or oppressed or whatever. Those two words. I'm the daughter of an English language writing teacher, forgive me. But I love what you did in those two columns.
Great, yeah, thank you for those comments. And I think with the burden, the choice of the word burden, I think we pulled that from the language guide that I need to confirm for that ODHS and OHA presented as an alternative to prioritized populations. I think that's where that one came from.
That's a great reference. Thank you for reminding me that linking and cross-referencing the different plans, the strategic plan and the equity action plan and the governor's equity plan and the strategic plan. That's really important to me. So thank you for that reference.
I'm also a really visual person, and there's some frameworks later in this deck that sort of show health equity at the center with things coming off. That, to me, that helps me sort of wrap my mind around it. But we'll get there a little bit later on in the deck. We did update the populations. You'll see that purple text starting about halfway down the column. And this aligns with a bill that was released in 2022 that updated the identified populations in Oregon.
So these changes make sense to me. I'm open to changing the word on to in, if folks want to do that, and leaving burden so that we're in line with the other frameworks. I don't know, Andy or Chicky, of reactions.
No additional reactions from me, thank you.
Likewise.
Wonderful. Okay, so the next slide we can skip past. This is sort of a reference just to show you what the strategic pillars were. And so this was a polling question that we didn't get to last time, but we think it's an important one. And it's around, what do you think are the biggest barriers to advancing PEBB's goals around health inequities? If folks can just scan that QR code, it should prompt you to respond. And folks, a minute or two to hit that time. give it another minute or two as folks get their responses in. The other comment I'll make is that this is a list of some barriers. There certainly are others, and so we can open it up at the end, and if there are other things that jump to mind as potential hurdles. Certainly can be.
Maybe you'll have to choose more than one.
I don't know the functionality. Can they choose more than one then?
I just chose one, but I'm seeing these, I'm seeing these numbers and I'm like, how many do you have? Yeah.
I only chose one.
Okay.
I know, I was just noticing that, I should go back and edit it, couldn't I?
All right, so yeah, so far, I'm sure responses are going to keep trickling in, but carrier capabilities is a big one. Resources, finite resources for board and staff members is number two. Board composition, really, there's folks that have chimed in on all these are all barriers. Are there any that jump to mind for folks that aren't here? Any other barriers that aren't identified as an option?
You say capabilities, I say commitment.
Yeah. Yeah, good distinction. We're gonna talk about that in a little bit.
Maybe one level of what, accountability.
Betcha.
Interesting to say do get. All right, so thank you everyone for responding to those. Hopefully there were no tech issues for anyone dialing in with that. So at this point, we'll shift. We'll talk about some innovative strategies and how those intersect with well-being and health equity. Kick us off, I hand over to Dr. Novick.
So the area of innovation is one that's ever changing. So these are just a few that we're seeing as emerging areas of innovation that our clients of all kinds are seeing and talking about these days. And no particular order of priority here, but inclusive family planning benefits that include expansion to adoption and surrogacy, regardless of what the definition of the family is. So broadly defined. Women's health expanded to include menopause education and supporting benefits. We're seeing some of the specialty vendors who have traditionally been focused on fertility and those kinds of support systems are moving to women of all ages, all needs. Reproductive benefits to include care provided by doulas or non-traditional birth workers. So you see a theme here, more support for family and women. And then on the front of determinants of health, what are the things that influence us to live the life that we live and do the things that we do? We're seeing more and more, and we touched on this the last time, that work is being considered a determinant of health. People are overburdened with more work that they can accomplish in time allotted. There are vacancies in positions that normally would help do the work, and then less control over the work than we've ever had. And not even to mention the possibility of the stress and strain of bots taking over for us and not even being needed in the workforce. So a lot of different things that our workforces contend with. And then the increased utilization of social determinants of health. So now that we recognize that there are these factors out there, and as you know, carriers are gradually trying to, I just had to update my profile on my carrier, and it was asking questions about social determinants of health and ethnicity and things like that. So we know that the effort is starting. How far it is right now is probably still in its neophyte infancy stage, but it's a start. And we're seeing more and more organizations, not only carriers, but especially vendors that are trying to make use of that data and offer solutions and support insofar as they can. We talked about this before, we'll talk about it in a moment again, is that when it comes to social determinants of health, the employer may have some role in that. The community may have some role in that, the world may have some role in that, but there are a lot of stakeholders in that discussion. So interested parties, not stakeholders. Excuse me. That's a term that we're trying to avoid using. Any thoughts about the innovations that you're seeing that you don't have listed here? Come across your desk or your minds? Certainly technology and we're not mentioning it because it's been there for a while, but the continued use and uptake of virtual care and access to care in that fashion. Talking before the meeting about all the things that are available by telephone and even by internet, some good, some bad. And that's the challenge, right? I was just talking about a commercial I saw from hers, and it's leading with medicate yourself for depression. Right? Just sign in, start an account, they'll send you some meds. That's pretty frightening to think that that's the way we be. So along with the technology, there's good and bad. And with access to care, there's good and bad. So we have to be careful about how we promote that. Support it.
To follow up to that observation, this is Dawn. The question of network adequacy, provider network adequacy, and how it does and doesn't relate to technological access. If I am not mistaken, provider network adequacy is typically measured in time and distance, pretty old, pretty crude measures most of the time. And I have not come across a way to assess provider network adequacy that includes technological access in a thoughtful way. And I don't know if this is the place for that conversation, but if somebody does have access remotely to a highly subspecialized, culturally congruent, linguistically accessible provider, and they are able to access it, that matters in a lot of ways. And I have not ever seen anybody measure it or build it into network adequacy assessments. And so I put that question out. I don't know what to do with it, but maybe you all have found some information.
You know, I would say I've seen in the behavioral health space with some of these more innovative companies that they are doing exactly what you're describing. And they can, show what their network adequacy is by ethnicity and linguistic needs and LGBT needs and all of those different types of capabilities. And they can also show it by in-person provider availability within a zip code and then also within that state for licensing. So they'll show virtual availability. And they are putting performance guarantees around it as well. So it is happening. It's in a specialty provider area, I would say. And the way that they're curating those networks, in many ways that they're getting providers that don't take insurance. They are paying more. They are offering them also operational efficiency with the medical record system that they're having them offer. They do actually interview all of their providers versus like with an EAP, they'll say, oh, we have 10,000, providers licensed in our network, but they have no idea if they're taking new people. Whereas these kind of new companies are actually going to track outcomes and evidence. So a little bit is where I've seen it. I haven't seen it within like preventive care or PC as much.
That is encouraging. That is, especially to me, the quality piece where they're reflecting upon the impact and outcomes that the individual providers do and giving quality scores for their own providers. And they're even giving bonuses to those who are the highest quality providers. So there's some motivation for the providers to do well. So that's a nice model, I think. Comes at a cost.
Yeah.
But nonetheless, I think that's a good area of innovation to proceed there. Hopefully we'll spill over to some other. Any other thoughts about the innovations that you're seeing would like to discuss? Do we want to get to talking among ourselves, so I'll keep on moving that way. So taking the work as a determinant of health one step further, we're hearing it from all over the world, quite frankly. Centers for Disease Control is recognizing that it really stressed the leading workplace health problem, the major occupational health risk, including above physical activity and obesity. That's quite a statement, right? We've always focused on physical inactivity and overweight and nutrition and lack of sleep. But stress probably contributes to not doing those things as well as we should. Well, and the International Labour Organization estimates that around 2 million people die each year from work-related causes. This isn't safety issues necessarily. This is related to physical and emotional health. So really, we're seeing even the World Economic Forum saying that good work framework is really crucial to having positive outcomes for individuals. So really putting a point on it that this is a problem that's not going to probably go away in the short term. We need a lot of tools to be able to address it.
And I just want to lift up, I mean, it's something that, we have 2 folks from corrections in here, and, we have a lot of folks who work in institutions and, folks who are reporting to work in really stressful conditions and hybrid work situations. Like, we have a different continuum for folks in the PEB population, and I do think really paying attention to folks who have to show up at work in high stress situations, and we have huge vacancy rate. You know that, right? It just creates more and more of our workload, and it's something that we should be thinking about and support folks.
And when you were talking, Kimberly Hendricks, when you were speaking, I immediately thought of, I'm constantly trying to figure out how to address culture. And because if you've got poor culture or poor a work environment, you've already got corrections is very stressful. We don't even need to discuss that. It's like, dear Lord. But then when you are trying to address your culture and it's this, I'm sitting here thinking, what about the poor administrator that's trying to address all these things and you just keep adding the stress of trying to make change and then seeing your staff's health decline. And, when you're a supervisor, you gotta be careful how much you engage because you're not supposed to be in their personal business and you're not, but you have that piece where you care so much about your people. And so you're constantly being, how much is evasive? Am I getting in their business? And how much is it really my duty to say something? Which is, again, where we really engage with our labor partners and say, we need them to maybe be a little bit more in their coworkers' business because they're peers. And it's not a supervisor saying, I'm really concerned about, it's a balance that's just hard to do. And I don't know where we're constantly looking for who can teach us how to address things and change and make it a better workplace so that people are healthier.
I think that's an excellent point, is that, did anybody hand you a how-to book when you came to directions and now you're going to be a manager and an administrator? You did that, right? So you can pick that up on the fly. I know that there's a lot of organizations do manager training. Our behavioral health team is doing a lot of training of managers to address some of those concerns. But where do I cross the line? Where do I stay on the other side of the line? What are the resources that our people have? Where should I point people? And you're absolutely right. I think we know that culture and climate for culture is very localized. It's at those micro levels. The supervisor, the work team right there. You can talk about organizational culture, but what does that mean in the state, right? If we have a state culture, you probably do at the highest level. Again, all of your agencies have their own cultures and your different divisions have, and work groups have their own. So it's a never-ending challenge to get all of those, check all of those, and make sure everybody's got the right resources to do it. So it's a big challenge, no doubt about that, but you're asking the right questions, and just the concern that you have, express that, is starting point, is to recognize that we need some support there, and how do we get that? So I think more and more we're going to see that that's going to be a crucial element, and as we said last time, recognize again, PEB is responsible for benefits. They don't have a direct influence on culture, but anything that we can do to influence those who do have more touch on culture is probably going to help us all make the benefits more meaningful and effective. So,
You know, this is something too about you that I think is so important is recognizing where the support comes from, whether it's from the manager or from the peer. And I think that we are seeing both of those within different industries. In like a previous industry, I was in healthcare with licensed providers. A lot of times, you know, it is good to have a peer coaching program where then somebody's talking to their peer instead of somebody that is at a different power level than them. And so I think that is an important distinction, and having training at both of those areas, whether it's peer support or manager support, is really important.
we're actually here in Canopy in the presentation. I think some of you have heard about that, and there's going to be a demonstration or a trial, and actually you need to use it at the next PEBB meeting. So actually interact with it's a peer-to-peer support system that's monitored by professionals that can some solutions out there. Okay, moving on to we call this our clamshell slide, and really it's just designed to overwhelm. Because that's really what it can do. The font is small. We packed in as many logos as we could. I may have mentioned this before, but I had a vendor in the well-being space saying to me, by latest count, there are over 8,000 different vendors in the broadest definition of well-being in the space. And that's probably business to consumer direct as well as business to business. But nonetheless, even if it's hundreds or low thousands, that's just a tremendous number of vendors that are out there that some have the potential to do really good things for you, but there's no one vendor that's the best fit for the organization. And I think this points to the idea that we'll have to carefully curate what the needs are and what the opportunities are. This sort of reinforces that medical and well-being RFP that targeting in the future year. So yeah, if you can't read it, that's okay. That wasn't the intent. Shock and awe. Next slide. So I was recently at a Hero Health and Human Research Organization. I mentioned it before with them a scorecard for the state, and we had a workshop on lifestyle medicine at the start of the last forum. And lifestyle medicine is now both an academic and clinical discipline by definition, by board certification, reimbursable. And there are a few practitioners, a growing network of practitioners around the country. I think there's at least one center in Oregon, the last map that I saw. I don't know how many providers, but the idea is that this is an approach to making good lifestyle choices and taking care of those foundational healthy lifestyle choices that really contribute to current health and future health. The more risk factors we have, we know, the more likely we are to develop chronic conditions. A lot of those can be avoided by regular physical activity, proper nutrition, adequate sleep, managing stress, not using substances that impair our health, and healthy relationships, interactions with family, friends, loved ones, other meaningful interactions. You can see that there's an emphasis on the idea that everything is in balance. Targeting some of the root causes of diseases. There are a few examples of how this has actually played out. Not necessarily under the band of lifestyle medicine originally, but if you've heard of the blue zones. Blue zones are areas around the world initially that the book was written about, but now replicated here in the US in a few communities. And essentially, it's trying to identify the lifestyle choices and practices that contribute to long life, long healthy life. So they're focused on populations that live into their hundreds and above. And they identify the different things that contribute to longevity, healthful longevity. And these are really many of them. We have one in Southern California in Adventist community, Loma Linda. And they practice a lot of these things. Nuts is one of the things that they eat a lot of. It's under the nutrition category. But this is just an example that this isn't just a pipe dream. There is scientific evidence that supports that whole population that contributes their, or allows their lifestyle to include all these different elements, live longer and live happier, healthier lives. So how do we fit this into something that the board is doing? Is there a place for it within carriers space? Do we have providers who are board certified in lifestyle medicine? Or at the very least, are we using some of these precepts in our broader well-being initiative? Because that was sort of the debate at the meeting was, okay, haven't we been doing this for years? How are we doing this now? And the physician who was leading the effort, who was also the past president of lifestyle medicine, obviously has a bit of a bias to making this a clinical practice. Not, I shouldn't say exclusively, but primarily. But we really do think that there's an opportunity across that whole spectrum, from clinicians who adopt these practices and reinforce them to other healthcare providers who are using these as we have traditionally in the health and wellbeing space. So anyway, throw it out there. Again, part of the element of one of the elements that could be included in the broad strategy for optimal health and well-being and less demand on the healthcare system, and therefore maintaining our lower costs.
Siobhan, this is Solly. You mentioned a broad strategy, and I think you also mentioned, agency cultures earlier, and you heard a definite call out for more trauma-informed resources, services, healthcare, and there really is such a broad cultural difference between agencies of public safety, OHA, corrections, and then you've got more administrative type agencies, not that they don't have their own stress and issues to deal with, but you almost wonder if you can kind of tier certain agencies that are really asking for, more trauma-informed kind of resources. Canopy's been wonderful, been there for us and stepped up, but maybe they can't quite meet. So just throwing that out there.
And then just so that I understand, like, is this would be something that we would want integrated into the health system? I mean, ideally that the carriers would be treating people looking at all these different aspects, or is it like what you add naturopath on? I mean, I just want to understand a little more about what you're articulating.
Yeah, I think one way that you can address it is to include it in RP and ask what the capabilities are, and in your weighting of things that are important to you as the organization can decide how much weight that has in the overall evaluation. But I think that's the way I would approach it, is to include it as a capability of the organization and assess if that has a meaningful place. I don't think there's a downside to it. One of the points of discussion was, and one of my discussion mates on my table was the head of the health plan. He said, we already have so many things that are being charged to the health plan. Are we going to add another one now? So there is the counter argument to it that it is going to compete for some of those scarce resources. But I think the idea is that if you really address those foundational elements of health and well-being, it impacts everything. We know that people have chronic conditions. If they have regular physical activity, proper nutrition, sleep, manage stress, substance-free, healthy relationships, they get better, or they're better, as good as they can be. So it's not like it's, and this is not to even make a judgment on the naturopathy. This is not necessarily naturopathy. That could be an element of it, but this isn't the same. Let's just include that in the network. This is American Medical Association, or aware of, I should say, acknowledged discipline of medicine. So it definitely has a place in the overall scheme of healthcare delivery.
Yeah, if I could just add on to this, I mean, one of the dynamics here, and I think it's great that this is a more active conversation in medicine, which traditionally has been sort of like breaking apart a person into discrete things that might be wrong, and then trying to fix them, which has been successful in some, that's one model. But this is really an intersection between more of a public health approach rather than a clinical approach. And I think the clinical approach is going to struggle because you can't what we're really saying, and you mentioned blue zones has struggled to translate this into something that spreads. And the reason is because what's really happening with this is that the community in which people live produce these things, or they produce the opposite of these things. So the Adventists, for example, like no one drinks in that community. And so the temptation is quite low because it's like no one drinks in that community. And whereas if you're in an environment where it's very normal to drink, in fact, when after work you unwind with your coworkers or whatever, and you go, that's what you do, that's a culture. And you can't purchase culture. You can purchase an app or whatever to help you as a person to try to emulate some of the cultural outcomes, but really culture produces things. And so when we think about culture, then we have kind of two things in order of difficulty. Literally the community, the city in which our workers live, which we have nearly no influence on, although that was part of the move originally to CCOs, was to try to get them to nudge them to think about the whole community collectively, to limited success, I'd say. And then the next layer would be our agencies, which have their own culture. But you can't purchase a thing that makes those cultures change. And so I just would add some caution and also like a note of strategy that we have attempted when we've done the hero scorecard and our wellness manager that we engage with, like that is its purpose, is to try to embed a cultural change without the medical system trying to like prescribe a pill essentially that solves culture, but rather that we, in other words, there's a certain amount of work that we have to do as an organization with our organization to change the culture, and that just can't be bought. It's just like a long-term strategy that requires committees and leadership buy-in. So I just want to call that out related to these things. Not that there's also the things that we can do to add on to help add some wind in the sails, so to speak, on some of these elements, for sure. But also, it's a cultural product outcome. This is still kind of individual.
Sean, that was great. Were you looking ahead? That was perfect.
Oh, I was.
Next slide. That was excellent. Thank you. Because what you're describing is truly systems thinking. It really encompasses all those different things that you were talking about, from what we can do with the healthcare providers to what we can do with culture, ethics and legal leadership training, so many different things. So I won't read them all individually, but this is a model you can see the American Medical Association is putting out. There are a whole variety of different models that we looked at that attempt to try to put in graphic form what this all means, but this is as good as any of it as I've seen in trying to capture many of the different elements that need to be considered to really address all the things that we can to improve health and well-being for the population. For your recommendation. All right. So the question I'm going to look at you.
So the next thing here is just to share some emerging market trends. These are from Mercer. We did a 10-minute survey on health and benefit strategies for 2023. And these are reflecting employers with 500 or more employees. So just to show some of the trends here, just this, more focus and programs in place addressing the racial benefit gaps and health disparities. We also here to show, that some of the items that are currently in place, and I apologize, it's hard to see up on the screen, I think on the printed. There's a dark blue around the things that are currently in place. And so that's communications and languages other than English and health provider search functionalities, which we know the carriers are working on and are in the stages of that. Somewhat currently available. And then areas though that possibly could be explored, as we said, with this coverage for doulas, midwives, birth centers, and other care to improve outcomes. And then on the right-hand side, also we're seeing just some more focus on addressing LGBT plus benefit gaps. Again, this is kind of an innovative slide, but these, you know, inclusive family building supports, and then also mental health resources, other enhancements. So just having more of a focus on these things, and also family benefits. We have an follow-up slide, but just looking at an all burden people, and having that really be in, you know, an inclusive benefit, making sure that they're.
Can you say a little more about, so the most common thing on the chart on the left is the specialized behavioral health care support? And that's not in place in PEBB according to the chart, and it's not recommended either.
So the specialized behavioral health care support can be a very wide variety of items. It can be like the innovative PAPs that we talked about earlier. It can be also a substance use disorder, eating, you know, eating disorder support as well. So there's different vendors in the space that will provide that kind of as a point solution. And so we're seeing a lot of employers put that in place to really kind of call out. And a lot of times we'll do a behavioral health gap analysis for an employer, and then once we, you know, are identifying what some gaps are, then making that a roadmap recommendation. I will say some employers are seeing, you know, maybe it comes up that sleep is an area that a lot of their workforce is having really high sleep medication. And so then we would recommend that sleep provider would be you know, vendors that would have additional.
So what I think I just heard is those terms are vague enough that they don't actually necessarily meet a need that we can identify in here. And so using the term, focusing on that, including it in our blue boxes is not where we've headed. We've done that in other ways. Is that the implication of what I just heard?
Yes, I would say, I think when we ask the survey questions, we have to be somewhat broad. And, you know, we do know that employers overall are focusing on behavioral health. It's what we hear, it's, you know, so, but it's very broad and it's very individualized for different organizations. So I think that is a way to capture it in the survey question. Thank you. Let's see if I can put the next slide. And so just on this side, we just also wanted to share from the same survey, just, you know, definitely this, again, addressing a lot of the benefit gaps and health disparities for people with disabilities. So covering hearing tests and treatments, covering body support devices and prosthesis, enhanced speech and occupational therapy and physical therapy benefits, and then other enhancements. And then on the right also is women's reproductive health benefits. So we know that within the pandemic and over the last couple of years, there were different populations that had more of an impact than others. Women is definitely one of those. And so definitely we're seeing as a market trend, just more focus on women's health. Just a little bit on here as far as on the right side, the high rate, high risk pregnancy. So a lot of focus on this. The U.S. maternal mortality rate is the highest among high-income countries, and it definitely disproportionately affects Black and Native people. And so there is much more of a focus on this. You know, so a couple things that is a little bit more detailed than what's here on the side. It's just that, you know, again, as we shared that, you know, having insurance plans covering, you know, various birth facilitators and pregnancy practitioners. And you can even be, you know, chiropractors, pelvic floor therapists, midwives, lactation consultants. So just really expanding that service provided. I thought one other interesting issue was that the disparity in pregnancy outcomes for Black women compared to white is the disparity is the same regardless of socioeconomic status and education. So it's not an issue versus employed versus unemployed people. It really can impact anyone. So just knowing that I really focus on that maternal health.
Charlotte, do you have a?
Yeah, on that, under the white background section, the very far right bar, it says other enhancements for people with disabilities. It looks like there's some text overlaid. Was that supposed to be something that we're supposed to read? Because I can't read it on the slide or on my.
The two little boxes, but there's two little like circles that come up the right hand side.
Yeah, it sort of shows it. I didn't know if that was something that we're supposed to see or not, so.
So you can disregard what it looks like. That's something they copy over from the Excel chart. So sorry about that.
That's okay.
We've sort of defined the colors up above and then.
Just didn't want to miss a notation.
Good catch. Good.
On these charts, I mean, these are the trends across the country, right? And I think for us, I mean, I appreciate you looking at the, you know, there's disparities. You know, you could say social determinants of health within a zip code, but then doesn't matter the zip code, you still have these disparities, right? Based on racial ethnic identity. And I think for Oregon, I mean, like what comes to mind for me is I grew up in a place where near the Mississippi Delta, and certainly like when you look at infant mortality rates in that region of the country, or in Missouri, the adults of this one, right? And so, but then here, like, what does that look like for us and our pets population? And how do we get it? I mean, I would think we would want to be paying attention to that data for like, how do we lift up and maybe it's, you know, examples of like provide covering, for example, you know, like what are the ways that we need to help the populations that are covered in those. I just wanted to check my, you know, paying attention to like this overall picture versus.
Yes, yeah, so definitely this is more, national, and different areas. Certainly, so looking more specifically for again, but that population. All right, let's go to the next. Actually, I'm going to say one other thing about that. On the very far right side is also menopause, and so this is definitely one of the emerging kind of trends that we are seeing. And so, and it's interesting. So the U.S. is a little behind. In the UK, menopause has very much become part of their national health system and really providing the support and recognizing that it has a huge impact on the workplace as well as people's personal lives. And so we are just seeing, as Dr. Melmer said earlier, these kind of specialty vendors that are in the fertility space are also offering expertise and support for menopause. So it is definitely an emerging trend. And again, it just impacts so much of the population. So, so again, just more of an overview of these family-friendly benefits from the survey, just showing again, what different organizations are saying that they're doing, and then also kind of showing what is currently in place in maybe some areas. Surrogacy benefit. There is some breast milk shipping services also kind of under these vendors that provide these services. The other thing I've seen with the fertility specialty vendors as well is that they do have kind of what we talked about before, Dawn, was this access to specialists in different areas and a very wide variety of different things that somebody can do. So if somebody is in an area where they might not have this specialist, they can have access through a wider network, I guess. Areas that can affect fertility. Any questions on section there? All right, I'm gonna shift here to, so in the last meeting we had, I think it was, he talked about the NCQA health equity accreditations. And so we just wanted to share, as a follow-up, some information. So this is a relatively new accreditation, which is in place. They do have kind of these two different levels, the health equity accreditation and then the health equity accreditation plus. So this kind of gives an overview of what that includes. There's kind of 6 focus areas. So there's organizational readiness, race, ethnicity, language, gender identity, and sexual orientation data. There is access and availability of language services. And then there is also, all right, sorry, I missed the other 3 areas from my notes. Okay, and then on the next slide, it just kind of shows you kind of what the timeline is for the health equity accreditation. And the costs, we just wanted to kind of provide that. It does seem like it's at least a 12 to 18 month process. And then also as of September of 2022, there are 9 organizations that have had the health equity accreditation and have done the survey and have this. We also reached out to our Mercer clinical team. And so what they had said as well is that they are seeing it a little bit more, mostly with carriers and Medicare populations. In some states, I think the state of California, I believe, is requiring it. Medicaid, sorry, Medicaid. Oh, Medicaid, not Medicare.
There's
Yeah.
9 organizations in the country.
9 organizations in the country that as of September of 22 of this year have accreditation.
It's really brand.
Brand new.
It's new, yeah. Fortunately, the NCQA has a lot of credibility, so we sort of are anticipating momentum along this accreditation. There's a lot of credibility with the NCQA.
Not to get too far into detail at this point, but what's the largest unit of analysis, I guess, when we say organization? You know, because there's so much integration, you could be like Providence. You know, that could be like, yeah, they did one survey in the entire Providence network across the country. Or it's like, no, we met in Clinton. Like, do you have any sense of that? Or like, what do they need?
I haven't seen a list of those who've completed so far, but it's a really good question. It's not an insignificant lift for organizations trying to become accredited. It's a year-long process, and so I had to guess. A Providence is a good example. They would probably try to capture as much of their organization as possible because there's work that goes into this, but that's sort of speculation. So I think we can find out for you.
Do you like self-administer your own survey, or is it like a third-party thing?
So as I was reading through it, so they have a survey, administrative person you work with. They have a survey tool, but all of you have to definitely provide quite a bit of data and to show your systems in place in those 6 categories. So not necessarily third party, it's that.
NCQA does some of like the final analysis.
They very much do. Okay. Yes, you submit everything through their survey tool. They review it. Again, you have this contact person who is your survey administrator that is, I think, supporting you through that process. But then they review everything prior to granting accreditation.
So we do have a question.
Yeah.
From Chicky, go ahead.
So not, I'm hearing an echo. Just want to make sure that you can hear me okay. Okay. So can you still hear me? If Shoban, if you can give me a physical thumbs up.
We can hear you okay. I do see Stephanie's icon moving a little bit, so maybe that's the one that needs to be. I don't know. Echo.
I think I'm better now. I'm not hearing the echo. Okay.
Okay.
So just wanted to flag for us, right? So as I mentioned in the last meeting, in the marketplace, we're also looking at the NCQA Health Equity Accreditation. So I'm very, very happy to see it here. So between then at our last retreat and today, the marketplace team, we have met with the Office of Equity and Inclusion, as well as DCBS, is Division of Financial Regulation, and they all love this idea as well. Office of Equity and Inclusion of OHA did flag for us that in Oregon, we probably, and we most likely have more comprehensive health equity standards than NCQAs. So just wanted to flag it for us all, that we are in the process of doing a gap analysis between NCQA's health equity accreditation and comparing that to Oregon's health equity standards that we've passed through law, that the Office of Equity and Inclusion has been kind of working towards for the last, 10 years. So whenever that gap analysis is ready, I'd be happy to share that with the board and of course PEBB team, because that could inform an iterative approach, right? If there's a huge gap analysis, maybe, hey, let's do the NCQA Health Equity Accreditation first and work towards meeting Oregon standards, or maybe there's not much of a gap in between those two. So just wanted to flag that for us, that there might be more that we might need to ask so that we can also be compliant with Oregon's equity standards.
Great, thank you.
And we're interested, I'm glad you brought that up, Chicky. We're doing a similar exercise on our end because we previously have done DEI vendor assessments on behalf of PEBB. So we purchased the standard guidelines so that we can do a comparison and say, well, what is NCQA doing that we're not doing or vice versa? This is something that we're going to pose to your carriers in the round one renewal letters, renewal requests. Not requiring them to do anything, but sort of saying, hey, have you looked at this? You know, what is your organization's take on potentially pursuing this if the PEBB board decides that it's something that you want your vendor partners to pursue? And so in this first round, it's sort of information gathering from the carriers. We're not necessarily asking them to do anything.
That's great. Thank you.
Chicky, a follow-up question for you. What is the mechanism to measure / enforce the Oregon standards?
I believe it's with the CCO contracts that OHA has. So for the marketplace side, we're still trying to figure that out. So we're doing the gap analysis first, and then we'll try to figure out what levers we have to hopefully help further the progress in terms of what we're trying to do.
Okay, so regardless, that wouldn't apply to PEBB contracts.
I'm sorry, I missed the last part.
Regardless, then that would not apply to PEBB contracts because they're
No.
private. Yeah. Okay. Yep. Thank you.
All right, moving on to the next slide. Just wanted to share also a framework of digital health equity, just to brings to light. So digital health, there was actually, we were talking before, there's an article yesterday in the Wall Street Journal about digital behavioral health. And so just knowing there is so much digital health out there and what does actually mean. So there is a framework. If you go to the, I'm going to actually skip through. Yeah. So here is the health equity framework. Again, super interesting. I thought in this framework that talks about individual, interpersonal, community, and societal. So really is looking at that whole biopsychosocial component. But we will, within the work, the health equity work group, we are also looking at this framework and continue to bring this into our conversations as well. Go to the next.
So for this one, this is the last slide of the section before we do break. So I'll just sort of touch on this somewhat briefly because we're actually going to talk about this topic a little bit more when we get to the tools section around procurements and RFP specifically. But this is a major emerging trend in the marketplace and has been for the past handful of years, I would say, but it's gaining more traction. And it's a shift in model from moving away from typical plan sponsor and member experience, which is on the left, which is sort of a hodgepodge patchwork of different carriers and solutions, and it sort of potentially leaves it on the member to sort of figure out where to go, how to navigate the system, et cetera. And so the model on the right is one where a plan sponsor partners with an advocacy vendor who serves as that sort of front door for anything and everything. And so it provides a member with navigation, understanding where to go and when, so sort of like right care at the right time. There are some potential health equity considerations with this model around the advocate's ability to identify social determinants of health, refer out based on those. Cultural competency, of course, would be huge. And so, if this is a model that the board wants to explore more through a more long-term procurement process, there'd be a lot of sort of health equity questions that we would want to build out, in addition to lots of other questions around navigation and cost impact, member experience, and a whole slew of other things. And so that's sort of just enough to sort of wet your whistle a little bit. We are going to talk about this a little bit more. But before we stop for break, any thoughts or comments on this slide or any of the other content that had been presented in this section?
So this is a common comment that I make for all the new board members. And it comes from one of our, late senators who often was one of the sort of foundational architects of the Kaiser system thing, whatever. But so this is my point coming here. I just want to have a conversation when we're talking about advocacy of vendor that you pay extra money to do navigation. Technically, that is what we're currently paying our plans to do, because that's what they're supposed to be doing, which is coordinating care. And if we think that they're not doing that well, then we need to, and we think we need to pay someone else more money to do the coordinated care thing, then I think we need to have a conversation about how much we're paying our plans, and whether that's like, are we paying two different organizations to do the same thing because one of them's not doing it well. And that's, so that was, one of our senators for a long time. That was his hammers, like, why do you pay someone to do something that they're already supposed to be doing? That's their job. That's why you pay them. Don't pay them. And so, so I'm just bringing that up as a topic, that almost like a sticky note when we visit this later or in some other way. It's that I'm not against the fundamental idea, but it brings up some questions about, like, what are we paying for? Who should we do? That's it. I'm just going to leave it.
Yeah, good comments. And this sort of area, this trend that's emerging in the marketplace is putting pressure on more traditional carriers to sort of up their game along navigation and advocacy. So that's sort of a nice benefit. Around the cost piece, I think you're right. I think that to a certain extent, the admin fees that you're paying, Moda and Province, $60 per employee per month, give or take. That would largely go down, and so I think it would sort of be a shift of cost to a certain extent, but that would be a big part of the exercise for sure, to understand what that looks like, what any potential claims impact could be.
Yeah, that's good. And we also have a bunch of performance, like expectations and measurements of the plans around this stuff. So it all just kind of opens up the conversation, can of worms, which is fine, and great to have it. But it's just like, Yeah, that's our current model and, maybe revisit. We kind of revisit it every year.
Yeah, because it opens up so many questions, because it is a fundamentally different model.
Yeah.
Yes, Kimberly.
I would just add, my hope is that it's actually, this doesn't become, so our members get so frustrated because they can't get through the portal. Like, whatever the portal looks like, whether it's a live body and texting at what, we've got to make sure that it actually, people can get through the portal, because that'll be, then our world is gonna be crazy, because people will be so frustrated that then the member satisfaction, if that's what we want to call it, it just makes me nervous when we're funneling everything. We need to make sure that wherever we're funneling actually does their job.
Yeah.
Whatever that looks like, that's the piece that makes me nervous.
We should, this is Ollie, we should have some pretty good data on what on programs we did sign up for Motive. Noah did, it's out, so we should have. How that's going. Yeah, we will see how members are doing.
Yeah, and I'm sure Mona will bring that up again through this renewal cycle. We did include some questions, wanting more data on the Mona 360 program, now that that's been live for 3 months now. So to understand what's the engagement and what other data can they provide to us to sort of point to the fact, is this effective or not? Because it is something that is paying for, beyond sort of the normal course of business to do the advocacy.
Providence behavioral health advocacy program is really a slow rollout, and David and I about that, and just ways that we can get more members to use it and try it.
So, any other thoughts before we break?
How long's the break? When are we coming back?
We were gonna come back at 11. That's only, we're running just a few minutes behind, so what do you think? Should we do 11:05 or 11:10? Give folks some time to. Clear to you.
No, I'm gonna put it in.
I put 11:10.
11:10.
We got 2 bathrooms here.
Yeah.
There you go. We're gonna break until 11:10. Yeah. Thank you.
Well,
There's actually 3 bathrooms. There's one when you first walk in.
Yeah.
just so
Oh,
you
yeah.
know.
Right, so it's
Kind of like the
two,
public one.
yeah, 2 over there, 1 here.
Oh, yeah,
There's
so
a
I guess
mother's, that
4
mother's
total.
is that actually a bathroom?
no.
That's just a.
There's one, yeah. There's one when you first come out and 2 in that lobby.
Oh, and then
area.
there's one in the entrance, you're right, so there's 4.
No, no.
Yeah, it's not out.
But, that's one of the advantages of a smaller staff too, is like, you know, much more specific. If you want to see what's happening. I did them last night. I didn't have time to put them on for everybody. So this is about, I don't have any class. It's just, you just know. It's, I'm just gonna go.
That'll be a challenge.
Well, I was going to use them really bad. In the airport, right? Because I don't know.
Yeah.
No, and everyone's got their hand, yeah, and who grabbed the last napkin with this sunny hand?
You know the director, they might be having those deal festivals.
I remember.
Oh.
at least it's a direct flight.
Set? All right. So we're gonna get started again. Welcome back. It's 11:12. And Andrew, should I go with you?
Sure. And so for this next section, we've got until noon. I think we can make up a few of the minutes and end around noon. But this section is sort of just to talk about, in terms of how do we actually accomplish goals that are set by the board. You've got these different tools at your disposal. And so we'll just have a discussion on sort of level setting, how do we accomplish things, and pros and cons, advantages and disadvantages. I will hand it off to Henry.
Thank you. So the next 3 slides actually kind of talks about 3 different ways that you might be able to impart change or address issues in the health and other benefits. So the first, the 3 different ways are to essentially like work in the short term, and that would generally work with the current carriers when going out to major RFPs, and there's advantages and disadvantages of that. And then the second one is actually kind of more of a longer term look where you actually, I guess, be more prescriptive in what you're looking for and then potentially run RFPs, but it has its own issues in terms of resources, amount of time, and just making sure that you find the right potential advantage or get out to the right people that are going to do what you wanted to do. And the third one has been talked about a little bit, and it's in some board meetings, but it's kind of like been more of a part of the content, which is the legislative process, really, where there's like lots of legislation going on. There's lots of things, like Senate Bill 1067, some of the other bills that kind of require benefits. I think it's been brought up where maybe it's like you do have some, representatives that you work with, and that you might be able to, I guess, talk about more about where you want to go, especially in coordination with something like maybe OHA and some other entities, like aligning with, maybe you've been aligning with the governor's vision, but, just being even more prescriptive in some of the committees that are around there. That's being done, but, just kind of being more potentially proactive rather than being reactive in terms of your interactions with legislation and other committees. So that's the third way of doing it. So the first way, we're going to talk a little bit in detail here. It's kind of like working with your current carriers. So this is essentially the process that's going on right now, the renewal process, and we'll give you a timeline of this. There are definitely advantages in it. The current carriers have been working with you for a long time, so they do know you. They have been listening, for the most part. They've been, there's been things that have been done, some changes, working with health equity and some other, needs. And there's also other issues where, you're not doing an RFP every year. What you're doing is you're like asking for changes. You're not necessarily using the full force of the marketing power that PEBB has, especially if you do something with OA or maybe with OHA, you might get even more marketing power. It's all through your line in terms of your vision and what you're asking for. But you do have the ability to do some things, and you don't have to go out to RFP. So that saves a lot of time, but it does, some things like the creation of the COE, it's like you're creating your own thing through the current vendors, and maybe the visions aren't exactly the same across the board. And so it's been a bit more of a process to really change healthcare. So it's more incremental changes that can be done through the short term, through this RFP process. I think one other issue that's kind of been coming up with performance guarantees, we got those in, but now that there's the first signs of issues with, costs and trend and inflation, and they're getting pushed back. Because, there are inflationary pressures and, not to deny those pressures on the plans, but it's kind of like, well, you did agree to this, and now you're feeling, you're not going to meet this, and therefore, maybe don't want to have this in place anymore. So it doesn't give you the full leverage. You're just working with the current carriers in this case. So it's just some things to think of as, you know, your values and goals and what you're trying to achieve. It's like, are you gonna be able to do what you want to do just working through your existing areas? Or do you need to go and potentially say, you know, we want more out of this? And so the next step would be to, on the next slide, which is see a longer term, more of an RFP procurement solution. So in this case, you do have the ability to, you know, create bigger metrics, essentially ask for the ability in terms of what you want to do. You know, you want to lay out your vision of what you want. And then you can go out to the entire marketplace, not just, you know, your current carriers, to see what is out there. You know, which with what Steven showed you with all those little wellness vendors and everything, it's not all of them are niche. A lot of them are actually kind of big and might be able to accomplish a lot, or almost everything of what you're trying to achieve, or at least have a vision that is maybe more in alignment with where Ted wants to go with not just health benefits, but wellness, just like holistic care of your members. So asking through an RFP it is a lot more work. Representative Mills isn't here, but he likes talking about how much time it took. I was part of that process. It was multiple years. Brian Wilson's there here as well. It's a lot. The work falls upon him to, make sure everything is running well with procurement. But it does, you get to write what you want. This is what we're looking for. These are the minimum qualifications that you want in order to meet. And so, so there are advantages to it, but it is a bigger process and it will require a lot more of the time. And it is longer term frame. I mean, it's like writing an RFP for medical. We're not going to get it done in 2 months. It's going to take a while. Make sure you have your vision, make sure everything's written down, and then we'll go out and then apply. A couple of years down the line, you'll get the plan or get a plan to put in.
Emery, the procurement process or the RFP process, I mean, obviously we just went through it for you all, for the consultant. And if it were like for the disability insurance provider, it would be a shorter process and it would be for like a full RFP.
Yeah, and it's like the scope of what you want will also define like how long it's going to be, right? What you're asking for with health equity, addressing social determinants, and but trying to help the members, more than just that the medical claims payment, right? That's what you're kind of looking for, and not everybody does that. Trying to write it in a way that kind of really defines what you're looking for is, it's going to take a while. And yeah, it's not as simple as, we just need about 50 benefits for, so it will take some time. I think part of the visioning here, hopefully, we will get the vision of what your goals are, what you want to achieve. If there isn't, if there's a lot more that you want, maybe we need to look at creating a game plan for it. Okay, it's gonna be a RFP process rather than just working with very much. And maybe it's like, the whole process, with the admin fees, it's like, we talked about, we've gotten some concessions, but you're not going to necessarily get all the concessions or as much as you might want without going out to another.
I vaguely remember this slide from something that feels like it was relatively recent, like last year, I guess, where we were talking about our admin costs compared to average market of large agencies, and ours was above average by a ways. And we, as I recall from that discussion, the average amount of time that an organization like ours goes out for a medical RFP is shorter than what we currently are. That's the way I'm saying it. One way to say that, I guess, would be like we could do for another RFP, a medical RFP at the rest of the market, like how other organizations do. We've had ours for a while. Is that fair?
It is definitely fair. I think, the last RFP was 2015. It came in, the plan started in 2015. Yeah.
Yeah, Emery, this is Brian. It was released in 2013, but it began with 2015 benefits.
2015. So, right now it's been 8 years. By the time you get an RFP out, it's going to be 10 years. I think. If you're asking if it's time to go out for an RFP, it probably is. It's been. There are organizations that do it quicker. I mean, with consulting, RFP is every 3 years. I think that that might end up being returning to RFPs. On that sort of time frame, especially when we're talking about bigger RFPs here. 10 years. There's a lot. Healthcare has changed in 10 years. Where you're trying to go has changed a lot in 10 years. I mean, this changes a lot every 2-3 years. And so, updating the RFP to align with the vision, to align with the goals, I think is definitely something to keep in mind. I mean, especially if you're, with potentially doing an advocacy, like a big advocacy, where they're the front end rather than kind of like an ad-hoc. That's a different style of medical plan. That's, there's different vendors that are doing that sort of thing, and trying to. You're not going to probably get where. You're not going to get it right now because that's not what Providence and Motor does as a necessarily on the front end. They're building their own, but it's an add-on rather than this is the way they want it. But that's we want advocacy as front end. But go ahead.
Thank you, Emery. This is Dawn. Question about this term advocacy. Advocacy makes it sound like somebody better advocate or else you're going to fall through the cracks.
I think with my dealings in health, when I've gone through and done healthcare, I think that does happen quite a bit where if you don't know where you're going, you're going to fall through the cracks. I mean, these are big systems, right? Not just just the plans, but how care is. So having that person, I've had certain stuff where you have that person who knows how to get through, system knows who to contact, is so much more helpful. I mean, this is so like there for my wife, you just get that sort of thing. But yeah, I mean, it kind of is. You're trying to avoid the members falling through the cracks, right? I mean, just being part of telling the voters, like actually talking to someone like that, like, okay, this is what you need. This is what, increasing the touch points, especially if you're having a lot of these point solutions. I think one of the huge benefits of it is the communications, the awareness of these solutions are there, given to the members, and the usage goes way up, and engagement. So that's part of the performance guarantee, I think.
I want to suggest that the fragmentation that these advocates help navigate is a problem that's perpetuated by our plans, and that it's their job to seal those cracks themselves and make for a more seamless experience. Coordinated care organizations at Medicaid, it's their title, right? That's what we want them to do. It's and whether they do it is a really good question. And whether they meet members' needs and make care coordination as accessible as it ought to be is a really good question. But the idea that we have to advocate for our advocates to make healthcare accessible and accessed by our members and coordinated for our members raises my primary care provider hackles a little, because if the payer is taking money off the top, not providing the healthcare itself, but profiting on the idea that they're making healthcare accessible, I really want payers to deliver coordinated care. That includes internal advocacy, if that's what it needs to include. And if we can't get that, then maybe we do need to get a third party without the misalignment of incentive that the payer might have. That if it's fragmented and people are falling through the cracks, then they're not paying for that care that maybe people need. But I really want them to step up to that plate and seal those cracks themselves and not require advocates. In Spanish, the word for advocate is abogado, which is this word for lawyer, right? We shouldn't need a lawyer to navigate the healthcare system for us, and we do, or a doctor, which is what I do for my infirm relatives. It shouldn't need that. I want our payers to step in and step up for that.
Do we have a fundamental issue in that we are trying to put together care that is coordinated, but our members are living in a fee-for-service mentality where they go to their doc for things? They don't, all of our carriers have a big member relations or member services available that people can phone and ask the question, but members don't. They try and ask their doc, who, let's take a look at MODA. They're contracting with docs all over the state. What does one doc in Pendleton know about the MODA system and how to get somebody the best type of care they need? They don't. But we have members that continue to view things that way. The members don't think of it as there's a health system I should contact about how to get care.
What I was gonna bring up is go out for a big RFP. We're looking at changing, same as we did back when we went to Blue Cross Blue Shield. Our members have been with these doctors for how many years? He's my doctor. He's the person I go to. He's the one I do A, B, and C for. Now, this is twofold. I didn't think of what you were saying. Number one, that's where I go because that's what I'm thinking about. What I was going to bring up is that as a board, we have to watch what our members want. If he's my doctor, he's always been my doctor, and we changed the system, and now he's no longer in our system. He's not my doctor. Who am I mad at? Mad at you. Because you changed my system, and now I can't go see Dr. Franklin, who is my family friend, who tells me everything I need to know about the system. That's what we need. Those are things we need. And her point directly to what Scott was saying. Absolutely. That's exactly what, you were bringing up. Those individuals are the people that's what they're supposed to do. Then we need to pay them to do it. If not, we need to look. But yeah, that's my thought, where I was bringing up, when we went through the whole Blue Cross Blue Shield to Providence. That was one of the biggest, I was on the other end, and I was an advocate for moving to Providence. And I mean, I spent a lot of time at board meetings, reading the public comment, and pushing the board members at that point to try to make sure things. So.
I think celebrating and valuing the authentic healing relationship that forms between families and their primary care providers is the heart and soul of what I do as a clinician. It also happens to be in the title of one of my papers because it's so important that that's what we were writing about. And so the networks and the network adequacy need to take into account that contracting issue for providers out in the community and maintain stability for people. If in fact we're looking at changing payers, docs shouldn't have to contract with 1,000 payers in order to keep their patient base stable. That's what our system has put in place. But what you just said there is really important for that.
Yeah, I mean, we definitely would keep that in mind. I mean, yeah, the amount of member complaints, just with anytime you have change.
Yeah, anytime. I see my doctor maybe 3 times a year. I'm not the normal. But a lot of our doctors,
and the doctors, that relationship is very important, you know, the congruence and just make comfort, right, with your doctor. I mean, if you don't trust your doctor, that's a.
Fire him and get a new one.
And I think another thing is HIPAA is very misunderstood by a lot of people. And if I talk to a person on the phone that I don't know, where's my information? You know, a lot of people, where's my information gonna go? If I talk to my doctor, I know that he is HIPAA certified, he's not allowed to get my, well, that's not true, we know that. But that whole concept as well, because it deals a lot of people in HIPAA, that whole concept as well is, you know, really, really large, and people don't understand that just because, you know, for years, you all have sat on this board, know how long it took us to get him, where people would answer more than 3 questions. Because, and some still won't, exactly. And because they're afraid their information is gonna go to, who knows it, I don't know, some down the street, I don't know, but it's that whole concept, it just really is harmful for what we're trying to do, that we still have a hard time educating individuals how the healthcare system works.
Yeah, and just to know,
I'm still learning a lot.
this is Brian, and I've worked with for PEB for quite a few years, and just to note that since I've worked here historically, anytime the board goes out for a large RFP like medical or dental, part of what we do as a matter of course is we do a disruption analysis. So we look at, you know, how many providers would, you know, change. And I would think that that is something that will continue happening going forward, because it is a value that the board has placed a lot of emphasis on in the past. So from a process standpoint, I would imagine this is definitely something that we would account for in a procurement.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks for that conversation. Any other comments before we can change slides?
I would just say, and I said this to the web board, that this is really, as a board, this is really your leverage with an RFP base of everything. And so, you know, large public groups, on average, you say 6 to 8 years, kind of what I've heard. And so.
This third slide here on page 27, we talk about legislative regulations and committees as a potential tool. You know, what's mentioned earlier, it kind of has been foisted upon PEB and OLEV historically, you know, but maybe kind of change that relationship around a little bit, start, you know, advocating more publicly, more forcefully for where the type of support that you need, you know, with Medicaid, the behavioral health payments, you know, there was behavioral health payments that increased to increase access, to increase provider satisfaction. Just not to say, you know, why not have what the top, you know, where there may be some increased payments and like support to make the behavioral health providers more or increase the coordination in that case. So, you know, that'd essentially be collaborating with what OHA is doing, you know, but it's also, you know, with the vision, you know, and the funds don't have to just transfer out of the PEB stabilization fund, you know, maybe in some cases they can kind of come in if there's additional funding, additional support to help do those sort of services, sort of those values that, you know, Oregon and PEB and all share, you know. So it's getting those out there. You know, there's some committees, you know, with being, I guess, more, some of you are on like some of those committees like metrics and some others, but you know, the trend committee, some of the, you know, total cost of care committee, Jeremy was on it, but are you taking over this position?
Total cost of care, BVP committee.
Okay. Yeah, and so BVP is another one that's, you know, we've been tied into, but, and I think we're going to try to get a little bit more closely aligned and tied. I mean, it's a value that's been voted on, but you know, just changing how doctors, how providers get paid, you know, being more vocal about that and not just being kind of like a passive participant. And so maybe we can participate in that and, you know, help push along the change in healthcare that you want to see. The next slide, what we kind of want to talk about here is, there's a question about dental access, and in terms of the issues with Willamette closing their locations and maybe people in rural locations not necessarily getting the providers. I kind of wanted to almost kind of game plan, like, well, okay, what is your issue? What's the value that you're trying to achieve, and what are the tools? How would you want to attack how you do this? So the issue, so in certain locations, access for Willamette Dental Group's minimal, non-existent, they closed it. There's also, I guess, a separate question is, the Willamette plan design is richer than what Delta Dental has. So that's the other crux of the issue. It's not just getting doctor wide, well, there's Delta Dental, but they have to be one. So those are the kind of competing issues. So what are the game plan for solutions? Okay, there's various ways you could say, hey, Willamette, we hired you to have providers in these locations. Get providers in these locations. Is that going to work? I think we can make that request in a little letter. But financially, it may not make sense for them, or they just can't find providers. No one wants to work those locations or whatever. What's that?
And they actually told us
Yeah.
they're not planning to expand their.
Yeah, we're not planning
So-
to expand. So that does close out some avenues in terms of, well, are we just gonna, so what can we do to change it? So, maybe have a new dental plan or dental plan that matches climate. You could do that potentially for the Delta Dental, or you can have a dental travel benefit to kind of help, those people who are in alignment. It's like, okay, well, you're gonna have to travel, but we're gonna reduce your cost, the burden cost. So those are potential solutions. So what kind of tools would you use to do those solutions? Some of those might be, just, renewal letters, potentially, and I think maybe we might be clear this with Brian, but, just in terms of if you have a new plan design for Delta Dental, I mean, is that something that we can do through renewal, or do we have to go through an RFP in this process for like a co-pay plan design? So there's a couple different options there, and maybe your current partners, I mean, if this is going to be an ongoing issue with Willamette, are there other dental plans out there who might be able to offer a co-pay plan in some of these locations and have a different panel group that is in these locations that are being underserved?
And
so-
Emery, I see there's one option not included on here, and this is Brian, that is the draconian option, which is you could simply fire a provider or a vendor during the renewal process without replacing their plans, which could raise a whole different level of access issues depending on how your plan lineup is set. But in the renewal process, it's a lot easier to fire folks than hire folks. When we're talking about hiring people, sometimes it's easier to do that through the RFP. So, it probably wasn't worth mentioning on the slide, but that is kind of a draconian option that is available.
And Brian, this is Siobhan. So, if we actually did an RFP for dental, the earliest that could go into effect would be 2024, is that right?
Well, we will be talking about the timing for a large RFP coming up in a couple of slides, but I would, just thinking out loud, you may be looking at 2025 potentially. And again, that will depend on what other priorities the board will put in front of staff.
I mean, it is the most powerful tool, but unfortunately, it can actually take a lot longer than the type of. So I don't know if there's absolutely a great solution here. As we think about it and we work through the renewal process, we can talk about there's various ways of trying to address the issues, but just keep those.
There was one other thing, just because this is something that was coming up that we had a conversation about in a leadership meeting, and I think Damian, you were the one who mentioned the idea of having some kind of equity benefit, so which would apply to folks who cannot reach a provider closer in. And I actually think, I mean, the other thing I just want to lift up around the dental carriers, actually was vision. I mean, something like equity can be applied to vision too, but the idea that the providers that we have out there aren't meeting the needs of our members, like members have particular issues around hearing or on the autism spectrum, or, like there are challenges that have been raised in public testimony, both about vision and around dental in the care. And so, is there another alternative that we can look at that we say if people meet particular criteria, they can access an equity fund that helps fund them going to a provider closer to home, whether that's somebody who is potentially out of the network, or maybe they choose Delta, or, but it's something that isn't, like, I think the issue with Delta, if we talk about something like, having a plan design similar to Willamette, the cost would be really large, and it would be statewide versus, not targeted to the areas where we're having access issues. So just wanting to think about, and I know that's not like where we're going in the weeds here on this, but, there are even more options, right, to think about how do we address access issues.
I have two questions or observations. This is Dawn. One is that the Medicaid is integrating dental care into our CCOs. And I wonder if that's a question that's ever been discussed, having our medical plans in the name of whole care of individuals who have minds and teeth, as well as physical health needs and eyeballs. A whole person getting their care from an integrated network. There's something about that makes sense to me. And I don't know if carriers offer that sort of package or bundle, and if that's part of the conversation here.
There are plans that do, I mean, you could bundle it in. I don't know if those networks necessarily are integrated, rather than kind of, okay, you can get dental as part of your overall benefits.
Will contract with
Yes.
them on your behalf.
Yeah.
So that doesn't meet the integration
It
needs that I was hoping for.
No, I mean, it really doesn't. I mean, I think what Representative Dexter is trying to do the pilots where it's much more integrated. You do have coordinated care for dental, vision, medical, right? But that is a different type of delivery system. I mean, with Kaiser right now, you could kind of do that, although it's broken out between dental, Kaiser, medical, dental. But you could try to integrate it more in that case. But yeah, with the other plans, it's not. You don't get too many types, real true bundles. I mean, it's a lot of in name only.
Thank you. And I think it hit the same problem that we've seen in the other places, right? Those are the same fragments, and these are the silos that we've created. And we spend a huge amount of effort trying to get these things to link and not let people fall through cracks. So that was one. And the other is that Medicaid has just approved a dental benefit that is massively impacted by the workforce across the state. And so there is a good deal of work going on in terms of access and the sort of what does the existing provider network look like across the state, and how is it inadequate, and what needs to be done to shore it up, in much the same way that the behavioral health system has undergone this scrutiny in the last several years. And we've somehow suddenly realized that we need a really big push on the behavioral health workforce across the state. And that's true for dental care as well, I think, is what I'm hearing. I don't know the dental world that well. If that's the case.
Hygienists are in short supply for same as behavioral health providers.
But only hygienists, not dentists, and not the rest of the clinical teams? Orthodontists, oral surgeons, for the more severe stuff. Anyway, if there is a way for PEBB to leverage our work here to encourage our partners to support that workforce development in those areas of the state. And I think I have deep concern for our rural communities in a lot of these ways, as well as some of the other more urban populations. That would be of great interest to me. Thank you.
So that's kind of like one way to approach dental. This next slide, the slide on the left, the part on the left, we kind of showed during the first retreat, 3 different ways to try to bend the cost curve. And then so applying the different tools there on the right for different approaches, taking, potentially trying to solve for those issues. So paying less for services, you can see at the top. I think there's renewals RFP for COEs. We're trying to work with the COE through different vendors. Maybe an RFP might be a little bit quicker, I don't know, but it may not achieve what you want to do. You're talking about maybe neural networks or steerage, ways to steer for vendors or advocacy, actually. Going to for providers that may pay less or improve contract. So those things through an RFP might be there. The reference-based pricing, which is the 2% Medicare, that was through legislation as well. Knows what other legislation might happen with pricing in that case. Pay for fewer services. There are, you can work with your plans to kind of try to find and address those low value services, and improve the prior auth and care management aspects of it. But there's also other things that you can do. There are other vendors out there who might help pay for bundles, in terms of the whole cost of an episode for like a type of surgery, or fraud, waste, medical management, tighter programs around that. And then needing fewer services. I think we talked a lot about chronic care management, DPP programs, and other things like that. We are working through, or have worked through the plans for DPP, but it ends up being, you got 2 different DPP programs now. Is that ideal? Not necessarily. Wouldn't RFP be a better process, and then have that for everybody? Possibly, but it does take more services or more work to kind of get at those things. So there are definitely ways, if you're okay with kind of like a piecemeal approach, through the renewal process, it's definitely quicker, but they may not be ideal in the end. And so maybe can help address it. The next slide. Yeah, go ahead.
Going on.
Yes.
Where would you put alternative payment models in schools?
We can work with plans to increase that. However, I think
they've shown us that they're not interested.
Yes.
So I think that's probably an RFP.
Yes, I think, that's kind of part of, like if you haven't gotten where you want to go through nice request.
Or not so nice.
Or not so nice request. Yeah, then RFP, that would be move to the next step, right?
Okay.
And so, I mean, it kind of, with the legislation as well, right?
I think that's what.
Yeah, I mean, it may end up going to that. I mean, you do have that compact and requirements. I mean, legislation.
All right, so we would put that kind of the zone of like pay less for services.
Yeah.
We met with the hospital association last week, and there's no LC out there to the hospital cap. It's not that great.
So actually, speaking of alternative payment methods, I think the LAN, Learning Action Network, we've talked about it in the different, the 4 types of value-based payments. I think this is something that's a little bit newer. I think it came out this year. It's advancing health equity through alternative payment methodologies. And to your point, Sean, this may, what we're potentially asking for there on the right in terms of the APM design elements, the secondary drivers. So you take a look at some of those things, you know, partnership with community-based organizations, you know, provisions of, you know, different types of care, integrated care, organizational capabilities, and then, you know, payments and metrics tied to around those and adjusting for the risk of the populations, not the necessarily risk score of the populations, but the social and determined risks of the populations. Those sorts of things aren't really in the payments now, generally. I think take a look at those lists. There are a lot of really good things that you could do, but you might have to request them via an RFP, right? You know, in terms of, we want you to address these issues. We want you to take a look at these, you know, this collection of data around disparities and other things. You know, we want you to integrate with OHA and the state in terms of providing that information. I mean, maybe that's only possible really through an RFP. You know, in terms of what you're trying to achieve and what you're asking the health plans to do. You're asking them to pay differently. It's like, okay, this is how we want you to pay your providers. This is how we want the cafe to pay. This is kind of support we want you to give your care home, your medical homes. And so being prescriptive about that might be the way to go. But some ideas here to take a look at in terms of changing, just, you know, it's not just paying for service, it's you're paying for caring for the member. Really.
Well, I mean, to our previous point, John's point, I mean, the point, one of the points of alternative payment models from my point of view, in addition to cost containment, is integration of care, you know, coordination of care. Like the whole point is that you're not paying for sick care anymore. I mean, you are when needed, but that's not the point. You're trying to pay organizations to produce wellness. And their only option, their best option to do that is to try to treat the person as a whole person. And because that saves them money in the end. And so that it's you know, if they come in and they have diabetes, but they also, like, they're not going to address their diabetes unless they have behavioral health care first, then it's like they're going to make that happen. Because the longer that person keeps bouncing around the, you know, various fragmented organizations, the more it's going to cost them. Whereas now, the longer they bounce around the fragmented organization, the more it costs us. And that's the whole point of like flipping into the alternative payment model. It's like, who pays for the fact that it's fragmented? Right now, the worse they do, the more we pay. Around court. And you know, and they come to us on renewals and they're like, gosh, I don't know what happened. You know, people just got so sick, you know, I guess you just have to pay all this, you know, and they have no skin in the game on that. I'm exaggerating slightly because we have some performance metrics, but still, when it actually comes to who pays the check, it's us. On an alternative payment model, it flips it. Like, you know, they're responsible for producing these healthy people, and that, like, coordinated care is really the only way they can do it once you get there. So it kind of addresses, that's the appeal of it. You can address all these things because it flips who's on the hook. And it starts making a lot of sense to them to start coordinating care instead of coordinating excuses.
Anything that, I mean, in you know, an RFP in terms of, okay, you know, maybe you say these are the outcomes we will pay for, right? You know, this is
right.
You know, in terms of we'll make these capitated payments or the care of these members if they end up actually having better health, you know, and measurable, you know, whatever metrics that you have to measure that. You know. But you're having, it's you're asking for reform of the system.
Right.
And form a system rather than going through renewals. Right. So,
And we're member accountability.
yeah.
Because that's that piece, you know, a doctor can talk to the blue in the face. But if the patient doesn't take the medicine or get up and walk, or it really is, there's a piece of member
Or-
accountability.
True, true. And organizational accountability, like the organization doesn't allow them to get up to walk.
Yep.
During work hours, it all starts to roll in the wrong direction.
And may they not just crush the PCPs to implement and figure out how to get it done in order to get their money?
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Pay them enough to do it.
Right.
Provide them with the wraparound team support, enough support and tools to be able to achieve the outcome. There are a lot of metrics being executed by pressuring
Right.
who are hating life more and more and leaking folks.
Yeah, it's like the support of the doctors, I think, is like, we talked about the fourth pillar being, you know, punching blame, you know, a little bit later on, but yeah, it's like, that's important, it's like, okay, what's that going to do to do that, right? You know, are you going to actually put money down there and like help support those, you know, help coordinate and help have the health plan or whatever, take care of them, you know, coordinate that. So, yeah, so trying to achieve that maybe doesn't work so well if we look to the next slide in terms of a renewal timeline. So this is what we're talking about for 24, and this is for the 24 plan year, so it's not 24, but you know, January we're going to take a look at and send out initial letters. You know, we have responses next month, and we file them to the PEBB board, and then March we go through round two, and then round three, and final design final rates. So that's the general process of it. You know, and there isn't a section there for healthcare reform really in there. So we might have to plan further.
Between April and May.
We've got between April and May. Okay, yeah, but that might be more on the next couple of slides in terms of project planning for RFPs. And to your, I don't know, Brian, if you want to speak up on some of this, but you know, we actually put this over 2 different slides, so it's 2 years. So the strategy planning, we kind of put the first 6 months here, we draft the RFP another 3 months, and then, you know, send it out. And then so that starts transferring over to the next slide, which is page 33. Okay. Yeah, so RFP responses in the first couple of months of the following year. We review it, to do some interviews, and then you have a process where the awards are made, and then contract negotiation implementation takes another, in this case, you know, 8 months or so, you know, or more.
And just to be clear on this, that any dental RFP would be done on a different timeline? It wouldn't be part of the large medical?
Yeah, we probably wouldn't want to. I think, like, you know, we talked about reducing stress, and for Brian, you know, reducing stress.
Don't want Brian to quit.
Yeah, like having everything done at the same time, probably not ideal. So in terms of that, Brian, you know, how do you have any preliminary thoughts on how you might structure it? I mean, is it up to the board and what they want to achieve first?
Well, we do have a required RFP. So for example, the way our statutes are currently written, we will have to go out to market, I believe, every few years for our consultant contract. So based on how those statutes are currently written, that takes up, you know, some resources to do every few years. We will have, coming out of this renewal cycle for both OM and PEBB, some recommendations from DOJ on kind of some of the contracts it feels should go out to market sooner than later, or at the very least be completely restated and reworked. But aside from what's statutorily required with the consultant RFP, the board has a lot of leeway. Really, the biggest challenge is resources, and not only staff resources, but board resources too. And Emery, you went over both these slides. I wasn't sure if you guys wanted me to go present these 2 slides and talk about this at all, I can, but if in the interest of time, if we need to move on, I am comfortable with that as well.
Yeah, I kind of figured with the time, I've been a little long-winded, so I just wanted to go over kind of quickly. Is there anything else that you might want to hit that is of importance for the board?
Yeah, I think the biggest takeaway, and by the way, for those of you who I haven't met, I'm Brian Olson. I'm your contracts team lead. And you'll also see me as the lead staff for our advisory committee. I support our advisory committee as well. I think the biggest takeaway is we can fit a complex RFP on a 24-month timeline, but that doesn't take into consideration our ongoing priorities and then any additional priorities the board would add. So if we're just looking at a 24-month timeline, and if, for example, we were looking at what would it look like to have benefits or a new set of benefits available, in 2 years, the issue we run into is a bulk of the work would hit staff when during our peak times for open enrollment preparation and for typical contract renewals. So for that reason and other priorities, a 24-month project actually ends up being administered usually over 36 months. So if we're talking about a complex medical or dental RFP, it's probably best to look at it as kind of a 36-month front to back project.
I would just add that the legislation that requires us to go out for bid every 3 years for consultants really hamstrings the board and, staff's ability to deliver on other RFPs. And it goes without saying, but because we really depend on the consultants for a big portion of that work. And, you go down the road and then end up with different consultants. Yeah, it's really difficult. Yeah.
And we don't have any legislation to amend.
And that's what I was gonna ask.
Not yet.
Maybe Rob's doing that first today.
Now, one takeaway, I think, even though we have that kind of RFP limitation where there's certain things we must go out to RFP for, it's probably worth mentioning that for for most of your benefit contractors for the core benefits, medical, dental, vision, the board has a lot of authority, a lot of discretion to make decisions through its annual renewal process. So unlike other organizations that operate under the state procurement code, your core benefit contracts are carved out and you have your own independent authority, which is good and bad. It's good because you have a lot of flexibility to make different decisions on an annual basis that maybe other people wouldn't be able to make. And you can keep those contracts longer without running afoul of any direct contract or procurement requirements. And really what you want to focus on in the renewal context is just making sure you're keeping those decisions within the scope of what was in that original RFP. And by scope, I mean same types of services. So as long as you're not, for example, you would not be able to add, let's say, FSA administration to a medical contract during a renewal process. But you could ask that medical plan to change the way it actually delivers care, and potentially in a way that looks completely different than what its proposal looked like in that underlying RFP. So just a note, a lot of discretion in how you guys do renewals. And, it comes with some good and some bad as well.
And one other piece you mentioned, I think, Ollie, earlier, there's that, or someone did, about Dexter's bill, but let's see something like that passed. That would impact any renewal timeline, right? Directed legislature would do something.
And I didn't hear that question, Siobhan. At the end, it kind of got quiet.
Sure, sorry, so Dexter's bill was mentioned around coordinating care, I think in regions, like holistically.
Global budget.
And, but if something like that passed, that would impact any renewal timelines, like any large RFP we would do if we were directed to do something at the legislature.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, Siobhan, legislation has the potential to impact any of our plans. Really, whether it's, adding additional procurement requirements or contract requirements, or whether it's just mandating something that the board must do every so often. It really does impact how we do business, and we've just kind of learned as a smaller staff to be flexible, and to reevaluate things as those unexpected things come down on our plates.
So the next few slides just kind of like briefly talks about various ways of doing a medical RFP, or at least, the approach of what is actually carved in versus carved out. So that, be part of the health plan versus, you want to go out and get an advocacy vendor and you want to get the best in class wellness or whatnot. But this current approach right now, everything's kind of been essentially bundled into one plan, and you're kind of requesting the plans to coordinate that care. So with Modo or Province or Kaiser, it's like they are the administrator, they are the network. If there's advocacy, it's there. They manage the claims management, behavioral health, all those different integrated solutions, as well as the pharmacy. So that's the current bundled approach. The next slide, we've talked a little bit about the advocacy vendor, where it's like the advocacy vendor overlays certain things. So they would be the one, the people that your members would go to and contact, and under them, they'd be required to essentially help navigate, coordinate with the TPA, who's going to be paying for the claims and stuff like that. So and the clinical management. So it's not necessarily a health plan that's doing that. It's like you have a separate network for just paying the doctors, but the care management, the high cost management is not going to the advocacy vendor, and they're coordinating it, as well as integration with the pharmacy in this case. So the pharmacy is not necessarily part of, coordinating with plans like it currently is. It's not going through the pharmacy, it would be a third party pharmacy vendor in this case. And then so we also have different point solutions, and the advocacy would be there to help coordinate it. You would probably go out to RFP for a lot of those different solutions. Some of the vendors do have preferred point solutions in many cases. So like we behoove you to see what they have as offerings and for pricing, and hopefully integration is better in that case. Those programs well, but maybe they aren't. And so we would request the advocacy vendor to help coordinate with that and to direct members to the right point solutions.
And Emery, I think one big takeaway for the board is, for something as complex as a medical RFP, we really should look at it as almost like a lot of mini RFPs wrapped up in one. So in the previous RFP that resulted in the 2015 medical benefits, we had kind of one process where statewide plans were evaluated and then selected. And then we had kind of a separate process where regional coordinated care model plans were evaluated and selected. And this slide shows kind of a further way we could dice the RFP and break out other kind of mini RFPs underneath that.
Yeah, and that bar at the bottom is even section well-being, like in terms of the integration. I don't know if you want to integrate with the medical RFP in terms of how big of a monster that would become, but keeping that in mind as well. The integration of wellness and well-being, and potentially the health plan advocacy member, and making sure it's not just separate. It's like all together holistic as well. And then the RFP scope is on the next slide. We will actually go through it. It's like very ways of looking at just things to think about as we go through potentially next week. But with that, I think we're actually at the lunch break.
I just make a comment, Siobhan. I just wanted to mention, ideally, you go for PEBB is a 300,000 life RFP rather than PEBB. Not that should impact PEBB's direction, but it's having the second board retreat as well, and they're going to discuss similar things. So just be aware of that.
And they would be on, if they did a large RFP, they would be on the same timeline as we would if we did.
Essentially, like a month or two.
I mean, they have to start early.
Yeah, it was work, yeah.
And the same staff would be working on both RFPs, so bandwidth.
And the winner.
Yeah, Kimberly, I think that's part of our discussions we'd have with both boards is ideally, I think there's some administrative efficiencies by doing it together without sacrificing the board's decision-making. Which not to get too far into the weeds, but I think basically we would want to do it together in parallel as one big RFP, even though there may be separate decision-making paths.
Helpful to know.
Yes, thank you, Brian.
Okay,
So how long are we on break till?
30 minutes?
30 minutes? Okay, so we'll come back at 12:45. Thank you, online participants. Commissioner Murray.